bulshooy qarannimada hano bulshooy hadiya goor heega noqo bulshooy qarannimada hano bulshooy hadiya goor heega noqo
The next person is our keynote speaker, a very talented brother who's very vocal. Aman Obsiye, who's the first Somali American to receive a Juris Doctor at the University of Minnesota Law School. He's a good friend as well, and he's a poet. You guys don't know yet. But here he is. Please, Aman, come on out.
Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon all of you. Let me say thank you to Abdi Phenomenal, for hosting a phenomenal event. Living up to his name, right? Alrighty. So this event is called Hasuso, Remember in 1960. But for us to really remember 1960, we have to actually take a step back and go back to 1950. But before I even begin the lecture, I would like to say that Somalis, being black Africans, they were, victims of European colonialism. They were victims of the scramble of Africa. And so before the colonial era, we did have our own, system of governance. I jokingly call them the era of BC, and not before Christ, but before colonialism. And we had different sultanates. We had, most notably, the Adil Sultanate, which our father of our civilization is Ahmed Gure. He was the father of Somali civilization. He was the head of the Adil Sultanate. But you also had the Ajuran Sultanate, which was based out of Mogadishu. You had the Sultanate of Hobyo, the Sultanate of Majertinia, the Sultanate of Makhir, and who could forget the Dirawish state led by Abdullahi Muhammad Hassan, aka the Mad Mullah. So these are some of our systems BC. And so to remember, like I said, to remember 1960, we have to go back to 1950. And we have to take a little, time machine into history. This era was, as you know, the Allies won World War II over the Axis power. And Italy was one of the main colonial powers in Somalia. What is Somalia today? Also, Britain was another colonial power. It's something we have in common with our American counterparts is we also had to fight British colonialism to be free and get our republic. So it's something we have in common. So there was a new organization that was made, which is famous now, but it was called the United Nations. And the United Nations, as we all know, was created in 1945 in San Francisco, right here in the United States. And one of the tasks they had was, what do we do with the colonial territories that the Axis had? Because they lost the war, the Allies won, they created this international organization. So they said, what do we do, I guess, with like the Italian possessions? So on April 1st, 1950, it was decided that what is Somalia today would become a United Nations trusteeship. And they decided in 1950 that in 10 years' time, Somalia should be free. Hence, our independence was in 1960. If they decided that in 1949, it might have been 1959. But it was decided in 1950 that we were going to have a 10-year trusteeship under the United Nations, and we were going to learn how to self-govern, or maybe I should say relearn how to self-govern. And so in order for us, as I said, to remember 1960, we have to go to 1950. So the UN trusteeship had many different programs and many different initiatives to help the Somalis learn how to govern again. And we had 4 elections during this 10-year period. The first one happened in 1954, which was a municipal election. The second one happened in 1956, which was a national legislative election. But to me, the first truly democratic election happened in 1958 because that was the first time we allowed our women folk to also vote. So I consider 1958 the true first democratic election that took place in Somalia. That was the municipal election, and then followed by a national legislative election in which the women were allowed to vote as well in 1959. As I said earlier, we had two colonial entities that we had to fend off, the Brits and the Italians. So what we consider the North, northern Somalia, it was called the British Somaliland Protectorate. And what we consider southern Somalia was called Somalia Italiana. And so in the north, we had two main political parties because, as I said, they were allowing us to learn how to self-govern, and part of this process was to allow political associations. So in the north, we had two main political associations. One was the USP, the United Somali Party. Another one was called the SNL, which was the Somaliland National League. In the south, we had two main political associations. One was called the HDM, which was called Hisbiga Digil iyo Mrifle. And the last and definitely not least, the SYL, the Somali Youth League. And the Somali Youth League is very special amongst all the Somali political associations because they will end up, as we'll go into the lecture, they will end up becoming the ruling party of Somalia during the democratic era. They're right there on the first panel you see with the 13 men around this red and blue symbol right here. First picture bottom to the left. These people are our founding fathers. These are our George Washingtons. These are our Thomas Jeffersons, Benjamin Franklins, Alexander Hamiltons. So the SYL has a very special place in all Somali people's heart. So it was decided that British Somaliland and what we could say Italian Somaliland were going to unite and form this new independent republic in 1960, which was called the Somali Republic. We don't have the flag here, but I'm sure all of y'all know the Somali flag is a baby blue flag with a 5-point white star. Well, the Somali people were broken down into 5 colonial territories, hence why the star is a 5-point star. So you had, as I said earlier, British Protectorate of Somaliland. You had Somalia Italiana, which we call Italian Somaliland. You had Côte Français des Somalis, which we call French Somaliland. You had what was called the NFD, Northern Frontier District, which was part of the British East African Protectorate, which is present-day northeastern province of Kenya. And lastly, you had what we called Abyssinia Somaliland, what we call Somali Galbed, Western Somalia, the Ogaden region, what is now Kilakashanad, or the Somali regional state of Ethiopia. So that's why we have 5 points on our flag, because the goal was to unite and liberate these 5 colonial territories and bring all the Somali-speaking people and territories together under a greater Somalia. Our flag is baby blue, not accidentally. We wanted to kind of thank the United Nations for helping us gain independence, because they were the ones who said, you shall be under trusteeship for 10 years, and then you shall be independent. So if you notice, the Somali flag is the same blue as the United Nations flag. And that's the reason behind the baby blue of the Somali flag. It was because the United Nations played a pivotal role in Somalia becoming an independent nation state. So there's 2 important dates in 1960, June 26 and July 1st. As I stated earlier, there was 5 colonial territories, right? And the goal was to liberate all the territories and unite all the territories. We only knew that 2 of the 5 were going to be free in 1960. The French maybe being a little arrogant, maybe being, maybe they felt humiliated because of what happened during World War II, and they decided not to allow their Somali territory to be free. It actually was 1977 until they actually allowed it to be free. And so anyway, British Somaliland and Somalia Italiana became free in 1960. June 26, 1960 is technically the official Somali Independence Day. And the reason why June 26 is the official Independence Day is because you have to look what our elders were thinking at this time. This was the first of the 5 to be independent. They didn't know when the other 3 were going to be independent. They knew the Italian one was going to be independent on July 1st. But they didn't know about the French territory, the one in present-day Kenya, and the one in what we call Abyssinia, Somaliland. So they decided that, you know what, since this is the the day that the first territory is going to be free, this shall be our collective Independence Day. And even though July 1st is the Independence Day for Italian Somalia or Italian Somaliland, officially and technically it's considered Republic's Day. Many people don't know that. And that was because that's the day we united the territories and gave birth to the Somali Republic. So June 26th is technically Independence Day, and July 1st, which is more prestigious, is Republic's Day, or maybe our day of union, our Unity Day. So when these two territories united, they obviously had a united parliament. 90 seats were given to the south, 33 were given to the north, a total of 123 seats. The first major legislative act they did was the Union Act, which forever cemented the Somali Union, the unity of the Somali Republic. And I know some want to disintegrate the Somali Republic, but we shall never let that happen. The Somalia shall forever be one. And our ancestors in 1960, the first act they did was to sign the Union Act. These are the people who fought against British colonialism and Italian colonialism, so who are you today to say the Union shall not live? But anyway. The second act they did was to vote for a transitional president, because we decided we were going to be a multi-party democratic nation. So in order to be an authentic multi-party democratic nation, you need a national constitutional referendum. So the first year, 1963 through 1961, was actually a transitional period. And all 123 members of parliament voted for Aden Abdullahi Osman. And he was the first president, but the transitional president. And his tenure was for a year until we had a constitutional referendum. He appointed Abdurrashid Ali Sharmarke as his prime minister. On June 20th, 1961, the nation had their national constitutional referendum. Overwhelming majority of the Somali people voted yes for this constitution, which two things, again, signified the union of Somalia, and secondly, that we shall be a multi-party democratic nation. On July 6, 1961, again, the parliament voted to make President Osman again the president, and he again appointed Prime Minister Sharmarke. We had a few elections on this time, but I'll speak about two of them. In 1964, we had an election, but the nation faced its first existential threat in 1964. Haile Selassie, the former emperor of Abyssinia, seeing its Somali neighbors being free, being democratic, and he himself had Abyssinia, Somaliland. He had a piece of our territory which he colonized. Just so you can know that Europeans were not the only colonial powers. There was a black African colonial power, which was Abyssinia, and there's also black imperialists out there. And so in 1964, he unilaterally and I would say unjustifiably invaded Somalia, declared war on us. We didn't do nothing to this man or to Abyssinia. We were just 4 years old. We were still infants. But I guess he saw it as a threat. So he sent in his warplanes and he tried to destroy the nascent Somali Republic. But we fought off, and America and the USSR, the world powers of that day, told him to back off. But that was also an election year. And the Somalia government at that time said, should we postpone the elections? And they said, no, we're going to still host our elections even though our nation's at war. And Prime Minister Sharmarke has a famous quote where he said, we will vote with one hand and we will fight with the other. And this shows you the tenacity of the Somali people, that we will vote with one hand and we will fight with the other. Meaning we're not cowards and we're also Democrats. And we fought them off. They did not destroy what was built. And again, the SYL won again, and they made Osman the president once again. Osman decided to appoint someone else as his prime minister, someone who's special, especially for us if we're going to speak about, remember in 1960, if we're going to speak inside of the Minnesota History Center. This gentleman eventually became a Somali Minnesotan. He's passed away, but the Honorable Abdulrazak Hussein. May Allah be pleased with him and forgive him for his shortcomings. He eventually moved to Minnesota after the Civil War, but he was Somalia's second prime minister. And it's a small world, right? So they have their tenure, and then in 1967, which is the most important elections the Somalis ever had. In 1967, President Osman, the incumbent president, loses. Even though the SYL, which is the ruling party, won the election, they chose, thank you, brother, they chose to elect someone else from their party as their president, which was the first prime minister, Ali Sharmarke. So Ali Sharmarke becomes the president of the Somali Republic, and he appoints Haji Ibrahim Igala as his prime minister. Why I say this is the most important election for the Somali nation and the Somali people is because it's 1967. You have to you got to take again the time machine back to 1967. Osman, who is the incumbent president, loses to Sharmarke. He hands over the keys of the Somali state peacefully. Both the predecessor and the successor president both reside in Mogadishu peacefully, orderly. And this is what happened, and because of this was an abnormality in African affairs at the time that a president loses the election, hands over the keys to the state to his opponent, and they both still live in the capital together. So Somalis became Africa's first Democrats. We were Africa's first Democrats. Something to be proud of. And so 2 years later, the military regime of General Mohammed Siad Barre comes into power. They executed a bloodless coup on October 21st, 1969. Ironically, that we go from being Africa's first Democrats to scientific socialists. But he executes this bloodless coup, and it was welcomed by the masses. And the reason being is our democracy was a little bit corrupt from 1967 through 1969, and the people, the masses, felt that the parliament was basically, they're buying votes, you're selling the resources off. It became a nepotistic, corrupt system. There was no checks and balances. So so that was kind of the justification for the military to take over. I think the last election was in 1969, and Somalia was a nation of 5 million people, and they had 90 political parties contesting elections. Every sub-clan had a party. 90 parties for a nation of 5 million. It's ridiculous. We're over 300 million here. We only have 2 parties. So the army basically takes control, and the people welcome it in 1969 because they say maybe this will bring order, maybe this will bring stability, maybe this will eliminate the corruption of Somalia, which initially it did. He considered himself a Quranic socialist because, as we know, the Marxists, they were atheists. Somalis are God-fearing people. They're Muslims, and so he had to figure a way to balance it off. So he said, I'm a Quranic, instead of saying I'm a Marxist-Leninist, I'm a Quranic socialist. And so he tried to intertwine Islam with Marxist-Leninism. His era is actually, we have to admit it now, it was the golden era. It was the era that the Somali people and the Somali nation truly developed. He focused on developing the industrial capacity of Somalia. We became one of the world's leading exporters of bananas. It's funny, but it's something to be proud of, that because if you're a leading exporter of any resource, then that means you have some type of economic self-sufficiency. We also started taking advantage of our coast. We have the longest coast in Africa, and he built many fisheries and refrigerators on the coast to keep the fish cold and to export tuna and whatnot. He also focused on developing the infrastructure, developing the roads, developing the ports, the airports, things of this nature. He also signed, and he was the first black African nation to sign a large military deal with the USSR, which we had basically one of the strongest African militaries at that time. And we were considered, to have basically one of the most powerful armies in Africa at that time. But his greatest achievement was something that my father actually taught me before I started doing research was the alphabet. See, in 1960, when we gained independence, we would use the two colonial tongues. We would use the, English comes from England, so we would use the English tongue, and we would use the Italian tongue, because Somalia, even though the Somali language is an ancient language, it's an oral language. It was never put into writing. And in 1960 and throughout the democratic era, I guess one of the things about democracy is we have to have debates, and we have to vote, and we have to choose which manuscript we'll use, or which script we'll use to write the language. Him being the dictator said, we're going to use the Latin script, so be it. Keep it moving. And so that's what happened. In 1972, he decided that the Latin script would be the script for the Somali language, and this was the first time that the Somali language was put into print, put to paper, and this is the first time we started actually producing Somali language books, and not only books about the grammar of the Somali language, but mathematical books, historical books, social studies books, all type of books, and school books basically. And so what is the point of having a written language if the people can't read or write it? So what he decided, he told all the students, there was one year, I forgot what year it was in the mid-1970s, he told them to take a year off of school. So all the students, all of the graduates, the learned people of Somalia, which my father was one of them and took part in this campaign, he told them go to the rural area, because 2/3 of the Somali population live in the rural area. So go to the rural area and teach your people how to read and write in the Somali language. And this was actually one of the greatest literacy campaigns in Africa. And you don't have to take my word for it, Google it. So to me, that was his greatest achievement, to teach people how to read and write in the language, to eliminate illiteracy, and to have the greatest illiteracy campaign in all of Africa. I mean, that's something the Somalis should forever be proud of. But his eras will always be defined by a war, the 1977 Ogaden War. As I stated earlier, Somalia was 5 colonial territories. Our flag dictates the liberation and the unity of the Somali people and territories. On a side note, real quick, today, many of our neighboring countries want us to change our flag. They tell us, there's a new Somalia being born, so you need a new flag. When Ethiopia, Meles Zenawi took over Ethiopia, he made a new flag. When Paul Kagame took over Rwanda, he made a new flag. So they're telling us, hey, you Somalis, y'all need a new flag because it's a new era. But that's not the reason. It's because what the flag dictates to us. And I let them know that we will never change our flag. This flag is sacred to the Somali people. So back to the lecture. So in 1977, General Mohammed Siad Barre, having one of the most powerful black armies in Africa, decides, hey, it's time to liberate the 3rd territory. We're going to liberate Abyssinia, Somaliland, and reunite it with its brothers and sisters. And we won that war initially. We took 90% of what we call Western Somalia, Somali Galbet, the Ogaden region, and the USSR stabbed us in the back because the regime that took power in Ethiopia in 1974 declared itself, they overthrew Haile Selassie, they declared themselves to be Marxist-Leninists, and the USSR decided that it's going to switch allegiances and join Ethiopia. We got all our arms from Ethiopia, from the USSR. So they cut off our arms supply. Because they helped develop our army, they literally gave the blueprint to our state, to the Ethiopians, said this is how many tanks they got, this is where they're positioned. Utter betrayal. That's why you never trust a communist. But utterly betrayed us. And then at that time, there was something called the Comintern, which is the Warsaw Pact, which was the counterbalance of NATO. So you had the Cubans, you had the USSR, you had the East Germans, you had the entire communist world on one side fighting the Somalis. We were fighting imagine fighting the NATO, imagine one nation trying to fight the entire NATO. You're not going to win that war. So the Somalis were fighting the entire communist NATO, the Warsaw Pact. There's no way, and we're not going to win that war. That's half of the world, and that's a world power backing them. So we lost because we got jumped. We didn't lose in our own capacity, When it was one-on-one, we won, we retook our territory. When they called in their communist friends, the entire communist world jumped us, and we had to retreat. one thing I would like to note is we will forever be thankful to America because at that time, President Jimmy Carter was the president, and this is the Cold War. My enemy's enemy is my ally. Carter noticed the USSR switch. The USA said, hey, you know, you have a long coastline. Looks like y'all need some new friends. We're like, yeah, we do. So the agreement was they weren't going to give us any arms. They said you had to retreat from the Ethiopian Somali territory that's occupied by Ethiopia. And one of the things Jimmy Carter told them is do not shoot at the retreating Somali army. Because usually this is what happens in time of war. When an army retreats, it's payback. You invaded my territory, I'm going to shoot you in the back while you're retreating and try to do as much damage to kill the morale. But the Americans, we thank them for making sure that the Somali troops were able to retreat back to Somalia intact, and we did not get fired upon once we retreated. So I just want to thank America and Jimmy Carter for that. Siad Barre was a military general, and he had a military dictatorship. He lost 50% of his army during the 1977 war. So if you're a military regime and you lose 50% of your army, then you lose 50% of your power. It goes hand in hand. So he's a human. You know, I always say the man was neither an angel nor a demon. He was just human. He did good and he did bad. And we have to acknowledge one of the bad things he did was he became kind of nepotistic and tribal in his politics after losing 50% of his army, 50% of his power. He kind of went into primitive clan politics, which in turn resulted in the various Somali clans uniting to overthrow him. And that's what happened in 1991. A variety of tribal militias got together, and they overthrew General Mohammed Siad Barre. And on June 26, 1991, he vacated Villa Somalia, and I guess since then we've been trying to recover since then. So what happens after that is the various tribal militias who overthrew Siad Barre end up turning the guns on each other, and our civil war ensued. I'm not going to really get into the civil war. We all know what happened. We have our scars, we have our wounds, but we are healing from that. But I would just like to say that every nation goes through a civil war. America, the United States, the greatest nation on earth right now, had a civil war, and it came back, and as one of the, you know, maybe the young people here, there's I'm back and I'm better. They came back and they were better, right? And so I do foresee Somalia coming back, and it shall be better. The nation style, you know, a lot of nations, they go through civil war, they fight, things happen, the nation is burnt down, but it revives itself, you know, like the phoenix that rises from the ashes. Somalia shall rise like the phoenix from the ashes. Our nation will be restored. Our glory will be restored. The honor of the Somali people will be restored. That is a guarantee. So one of the ramifications of the Civil War is that a Somali diasporic population was built, most notably in the Western countries. America, Canada, and Britain hosts the most, you know, Somali diaspora. And I'm not taking a shot at anybody, but we have to, as Somali Americans, we have to truly be thankful to the United States. Because when our country fell, when we were in a hopeless situation, it was them who opened their doors to us to say, hey, have a second chance at life, have a second chance at education and you know, being, you know, resourceful and having a second chance at life. I mean, I'm not throwing shade, but I mean, Saudi Arabia didn't open their doors for us. Let's be real. So we have to know who our true allies are. We have to know who our true friends are, you know. America will always be a strategic ally of Somalia. If it's not on paper, it's in our hearts. So the Somali diaspora emerged, and that's the last panel right there. The Somali diaspora emerged, and this emergence gave birth to a new clan, I guess, you know, because we're Somalis, but we're a diasporic population. And as I said before, we've inherited a lot of the American traditions and cultures. You know, a lot of us, we would drive to a Somali restaurant to go get some goat meat, but we're listening to the latest hip hop or R&B song. So we have to acknowledge that, you know, we have our foot in both worlds. Another thing that helped us out as a diaspora population is that we were able to send remittances back home. And we're actually the #1 foreign direct investors in Somalia. It's not, this corporation or that corporation. It's actually the Somali diaspora, or the #1 quote-unquote corporation, involved in foreign direct investment back home. Minnesota became the global capital of the Somali diaspora. And a lot of people ask, why Minnesota? How did Minnesota become our capital? Give me a second and I'll explain. My understanding from my research and my various discussions with people at the U.S. State Department is this. It was threefold. One, Minnesota needed diversity. This was told to me. So I was told that Minnesota needed diversity, and so the U.S. State Department kind of chose Minnesota as a state. Secondly, Minnesota, being the great state that it is, being a progressive state, had the social services, because over here in Minnesota, we pride ourselves on taking care of our people. We like profit, but we also love people. And so they had social services ready to absorb a new population. And thirdly, a lot of people don't know this, but the Lutheran Church had a lot to do with sponsoring Somalis here. So those are the three reasons: diversity, the social service, and the Lutheran churches. So when myself, I'm a Southern gentleman. I'm from Texas. I'm from Dallas, and I came here because this is the capital. As a Somali, I'm like a bee attracted to honey. I came here. And so what happens is you have the first influx of Somalis here, and then other people got attracted, and other people started moving here, and slowly but for surely, our diaspora population grew here. And we've done a lot of good here. I know we get a lot of negative publicity, but I just want to highlight some of the things. We're the #1 small black business owners in this state. We are one of the most visible populations on college campuses in this state. And when it comes to diversity, I think we've given y'all exotic flavor. I mean, sambusa is becoming a Minnesota tradition. And so you have to, as you see here, we have our police officers. We have a good friend of mine, Abdul Sameh. He's our first Somali American city council member. We have professors here. We have lawyers, myself being one. We have doctors. We have engineers. We have accountants. We have poets. We have nonprofit organizations. We are really becoming mainstream. And I think this event, the whole Somali week, yesterday we hosted thousands upon thousands of people in a very peaceful, a very orderly manner. And today we're having an event at the Minnesota History Center, and we'll continue to have many events. I think all of this signifies that the Somali American community, our population, is no longer an emergent population, but rather we have now emerged. And I'll leave it at that. Take care.
bulshooy qarannimada hano bulshooy hadiyo goor heega noqo bulshooy qarannimada hano bulshooy hadiyo goor heega noqo hawl qabad hanuunsana dantaadana hagarkada dantaadana hawl qabad